"Who let the farmer's daughter into the ball?" The Countess of Stourton demanded, in a voice pitched to carry, her handsome face rigid with affront, and a little ripple of malicious attention ran through the glittering crowd as 100 fashionable heads turned to find the intruder who had dared to soil the most exclusive assembly of the season with her low-born presence. They found her standing near the foot of the great staircase, a young woman of perhaps 20 in a simple gown of plain-figured muslin, without a single jewel, her dark hair dressed without artifice, her work-browned hands folded quietly before her. A girl who was, beyond any question, exactly what the Countess had named her. A farmer's daughter, set down in the middle of a room full of the proudest blood in England, and as out of place there as a wildflower in a hothouse. She heard the question. She could not have helped hearing it, for the Countess had meant her to. And the watching crowd waited, with the pleasant cruelty of fashionable people scenting a victim, for the farmer's daughter to crimson and stammer and shrink and flee. But the farmer's daughter did not flee, because at the very moment the Countess of Stourton demanded who had let her in, the Duke of Inglewood, the greatest man in that room, and the guest in whose honor the whole glittering assembly had been got up, was already crossing the floor toward her with his hand outstretched, and before the Countess's words had finished echoing under the painted ceiling. Before the malicious crowd had finished turning to enjoy the girl's humiliation, the Duke of Inglewood had reached the farmer's daughter, and bowed to her as though she were a queen, and led her out into the very center of the floor to open the dancing at his side. The question hung in the air, answered. The Duke had let her in, and the Countess of Stourton, hostess of the proudest ball of the season, was left to stand in her own ballroom and watch the man she had meant for her own daughter lead a farmer's girl through the figures of the dance before the astonished eyes of the entire ton. But to understand how that astonishing thing came to pass, we must leave the ballroom for a while and go back to a quiet country corner where a duke first learned that the finest thing he had ever seen wore plain muslin and stood in a farmyard. Alice Wheatley was the daughter of a farmer, and she had never been ashamed of it in her life, nor had she any reason to be, for there was more true worth in her honest person than in a whole ballroom of the bright bejeweled creatures who would one day look down on her. Her father, John Wheatley, held a good farm on the lands of the Duke of Inglewood. As his father and his grandfather had held it before him, a snug, well-run, prosperous farm, the fruit of 3 generations of honest labor, where the wheat stood golden in its season, and the dairy was the cleanest in the county, and no beast went hungry, and no debt went unpaid. It was a happy household, warm and busy and full of plain good sense. And Alice had grown up in it the cherished eldest daughter, learning from her mother how to run a dairy and keep a house and tend the sick of the parish, and from her father how to deal honestly and work hard and hold her head up before any man living. She had never been to a fashionable school, and she could not paint screens or net purses or do any of the genteel useless things the young ladies of the ton were taught, but she could read and think and speak her mind plainly and well. She had a quick natural intelligence that no drawing master had ever spoiled, and she had, into the bargain, a kind of unstudied grace, a way of moving and looking and being that owed nothing to any dancing master and everything to a clear conscience and a happy heart. She was, in short, a thoroughly admirable young woman, and a beautiful one, in the fresh, unpainted way of a girl who has spent her life in clean country air, but she was a farmer's daughter, and in the world she was about to be thrust into, that single fact outweighed every virtue she possessed. The ton did not care that she was good, or clever, or kind, or lovely. The ton cared that her father worked the land instead of owning it from a distance, that her hands knew honest labor, that she had been born outside the small gilded circle of people who considered themselves the only people who mattered. To the Countess of Stourton and her kind, Alice Wheatley was simply a nobody, a creature of no account, fit to be sneered at and shut out. And the fact that she was a finer woman than any of them would have struck the Countess as not merely false, but faintly impertinent. There was one man, however, who saw Alice Wheatley clearly and valued her exactly as she deserved, and unluckily for the peace of the whole county, that man was a duke. The Wheatley farm and the life that had shaped Alice are worth a fuller look, for they were the making of everything the Duke came to love in her, and the very things the ton despised were the things that had made her fine. It was a working farm, and Alice had worked on it all her life, and was not in the least ashamed of the fact. She had risen before dawn to the dairy as a girl, her hands red with the cold of the milk pails. She had helped at the haymaking and the harvest, her sleeves rolled and the sun on her face. She had learned to set a broken hen's leg and dose a sick calf and judge a field of wheat by the feel of the grain between her fingers. None of it was genteel. All of it had taught her things the young ladies of the ton would live and die without ever learning: the worth of honest labor, the patience that comes of working with growing things, the plain, unanswerable competence of a person who can actually do the things that need doing in the world. She had calluses on her hands and good sense in her head and no nonsense at all in her composition, and she carried herself, in consequence, with the unhurried steadiness of someone who has never in her life had to pretend to be anything other than what she is. And the home that all this work had built was a happy one, which was, perhaps, the deepest source of her strength. The Wheatleys loved one another, plainly and undramatically, and respected one another, and lived by a code so simple and so sturdy that it had never once occurred to any of them to question it. Work hard, deal honestly, help your neighbor, fear God, and never bow your head to any man on earth merely because he is richer or grander than yourself. Alice had drunk that code in with her mother's milk, and it had given her something that all the Countess of Stourton's wealth and rank had never given the Countess: a perfect, unshakable security in her own worth, owing nothing to anyone's opinion. She did not need the ton to tell her she mattered. She knew she mattered because she had been raised by people who knew their own worth and had taught her hers. It was that bone-deep, unborrowed dignity, more than her beauty or her wit, that had first arrested the Duke of Inglewood, for he had spent his whole life among people whose sense of their own importance was entirely a matter of rank, and he had never before met anyone whose dignity came simply and unanswerably from within. The Duke of Inglewood was, by every outward measure, the last man in England who should have fallen in love with a farmer's daughter, and the fact that he did, and the long struggle it cost him to admit it, is the heart of this story. Edward, Duke of Inglewood, was 33, the holder of one of the oldest dukedoms in the kingdom, master of a great estate and a greater name, and as conscious of both as a man bred from the cradle to such things must be. He was not a bad man, far from it. He was just and generous and conscientious, a good landlord and a fair master, with none of the vice or arrogance that spoiled so many men of his rank. But he had been raised, from his first breath, in the absolute unquestioned certainty of his own consequence, and in the equally unquestioned certainty that a duke's first duty was to his name and his line, that he must marry, when he married, a woman of suitable birth, and carry on his great house as it had been carried on for 300 years, and that the gulf between the people who mattered and the people who did not was as fixed and natural a thing as the gulf between the gentry and the soil they walked on. He had never in his life questioned any of it, because it had never in his life occurred to him that it could be questioned. And then he came down to Inglewood for a quiet country summer to attend to his estates and escape the wearisome husband hunting of the London season, and there, among his own fields and farms, he met Alice Wheatley, and everything he had never questioned began, very quietly and very inconveniently, to come apart. For the trouble with the Duke of Inglewood was not that he was a snob in the small, cruel way the Countess of Stourton was a snob. He had too much real sense and real decency for that. The trouble was that the prejudices of his rank were so deep in him, so woven into the very fabric of how he saw the world, that even when his heart told him plainly that this farmer's daughter was worth more than every titled lady he had ever met, his pride and his breeding and his bone-deep sense of what a duke owed his name rose up to tell him that it was impossible, unthinkable, not to be considered. His whole story is the story of that war, between the truth his heart had seen and the prejudice his rank had bred, between the finest woman he had ever known and 300 years of dukes telling him she was beneath him. It was a war he very nearly lost, and the losing of it would have cost him the only happiness worth having. If you are sitting by your own fire tonight, with the work of the day behind you and the world shut comfortably outside, then settle yourself in and let me tell you how a duke came to lead a farmer's daughter out to dance before the whole proud world that said he never should. For this is a story about the difference between the rank a person is born to and the worth a person carries in themselves, about the cruelty of those who measure others by their birth, and the courage it takes to measure them, instead, by their hearts, and about a good man who had to choose, in the end, between 300 years of pride and one true and living love, and who came within a hair's breadth of choosing wrongly. Before the tale is done, you will see the proudest hostess in England humbled in her own ballroom, and a farmer's daughter honored above every titled lady there. And somewhere along the way I shall pause, as I always do, to wonder where in the world you are sitting as you listen. But first you must understand the glittering, cruel world of the Tun, and the cold, proud woman who ruled it, so that you may relish the more the night it all came right. The Countess of Stourton was the queen of that world, and a perfect embodiment of everything in it that was hollow and cold and cruel, and she is worth a moment's study, for she was the chief obstacle. After the Duke's own pride, that stood between Alice Wheatley and her happiness. She was a great lady of the first rank, immensely wealthy, immaculately bred, and possessed of a position in society that she had spent her whole life defending and advancing with the single-minded ferocity of a general defending a fortress. She had no interests beyond rank and precedence, no pleasures beyond the exercise of her own consequence, and no kindness in her that was not calculated to advance her standing. She divided the whole human race, with perfect serenity, into the small number of people who signified and the vast number who did not, and she treated the second class, when she noticed them at all, with a cold contempt she did not even trouble to disguise. And her dearest project that season was the marriage of her daughter, Lady Augusta, a handsome cold girl cut to her mother's pattern, to the Duke of Inglewood. For the Duke was the greatest unmarried prize in the kingdom, and the Countess had decided, with her usual serene certainty, that he was to be Lady Augusta's, and had begun to arrange it accordingly. That the Duke had shown no particular warmth toward Lady Augusta did not trouble the Countess in the least. Great matches, in her experience, were made by mothers, not by the inclinations of the parties, and she had every confidence in her own ability to bring this one about. What did trouble her, as the summer wore on, was a strange and unwelcome rumor that drifted up to town from the Duke's country estate, a rumor that the Duke of Inglewood, instead of dancing attendance on suitable young ladies as a duke should, was spending his country summer in the company of some farmer's daughter, some nobody from his own tenantry, in a manner that was beginning to be talked about. The Countess of Stourton did not at first believe it, the thing was too absurd. But the rumor persisted and grew, and the Countess, scenting a threat to her cherished project, resolved to look into it, and if necessary to crush it. She was not a woman who let nobody stand in the way of her plans. She was about to discover that this particular nobody, and the Duke who loved her, would take a very great deal of crushing. The Countess of Stourton's daughter, Lady Augusta, is worth a brief look, for she was the match the whole world expected the Duke to make, and the contrast between her and Alice was the contrast between everything the ton valued and everything that truly mattered. Lady Augusta was, by every standard the world recognized, the perfect bride for a duke. She was the daughter of an earl on one side and a long line of the proudest blood in England on the other. She was handsome. In a cold, flawless way, she had been educated to the highest pitch of fashionable accomplishment, could speak 3 languages and play the harp and conduct herself in any drawing-room in Europe with faultless propriety. And she had been raised, from her cradle, in the certain expectation of a great match, and saw nothing in the least presumptuous in her mother's plan to secure her the greatest match of all. She was not stupid, and she was not quite as cruel as her mother, but she was hollow, in the particular way of a person who has been taught to value only the surfaces of things, and there was nothing underneath her polished perfection but a cold conviction of her own importance and a well-bred contempt for everyone beneath her. Set beside Alice Wheatley, she showed, to anyone with eyes to see, exactly what the world's scale of values was worth. Lady Augusta had every advantage of birth and breeding, and not one particle of the warmth, the honesty, the courage, or the unbought worth that made Alice what she was. She could play the harp, but she could not have nursed a stranger through a fever. She could converse in 3 languages, but she had never in her life said a single honest thing that cost her anything. She was, for all her flawless surface, a far smaller and poorer creature than the farmer's daughter she despised. And the Duke, who had been meant to marry her, had taken her exact measure long before that summer, and found her wanting, for he was not, whatever his faults. A man who could be content with a cold, flawless surface, and he had recognized in Alice Wheatley, by contrast, the living warmth that Lady Augusta would never possess if she lived to be 100. His choice between them, when it came, was not really a choice between a farmer's daughter and an earl's. It was a choice between what is real and what is merely fashionable. Between a living woman and a beautiful idea, and the wonder is not that he chose Alice in the end, but that his pride had ever for a moment tempted him to choose otherwise. How the Duke came to love Alice Wheatley happened slowly over a country summer, and it happened because in her company he found, for the first time in his guarded ducal life, that he could simply be a man. It began by accident, as such things do. He had come upon her first on a bright morning early in the summer, when his ride took him past the Wheatley farm, and he found the farmer's daughter in the lane, kneeling in the dust beside a child who had fallen and cut his knee, binding the wound with a strip torn from her own apron and soothing the little one's tears with a low, cheerful voice. And she had looked up at the great man on his great horse without the smallest awe or awkwardness, had answered his question about the child with a frank good sense that surprised him, and had gone back to her bandaging as though dukes rode past her every day of the week. He had ridden on oddly arrested. He was used to being fawned upon, deferred to, made much of. He was not used to being treated courteously and without the least servility, as simply another human being who happened to be passing. And he found, to his surprise, that he liked it very much. After that he found reasons to pass the Wheatley farm. He told himself, at first, that it was estate business, the natural attention of a good landlord to a good tenant. And there was just enough truth in it to let him believe it for a while. But the truth, which he came to see only slowly, was that he went because in Alice Wheatley's company he was happier than he had ever been in his life. She talked to him as no one else dared to, plainly and honestly, arguing with him when she thought him wrong and laughing at him when he was pompous, treating the Duke of Inglewood not as a prize or a power, but as a man whose company she enjoyed and whose nonsense she would not flatter. She had a wisdom, drawn from a life close to real things, that made the clever talk of the drawing-rooms seem suddenly hollow. She had a warmth that thawed something in him he had not known was frozen, and she had a beauty, fresh and unstudied and entirely her own, that made the painted graces of the tun look like wax flowers beside a living rose. He came for the estate business, he stayed for Alice, and somewhere in the long golden weeks of that country summer, the Duke of Inglewood, who had been bred to marry a coronet, fell wholly and helplessly in love with a farmer's daughter and was too happy for a while. To understand what a problem he had made for himself, there was a particular incident midway through that summer that the Duke afterward marked as the moment he first understood he was in real danger, and it shows better than any description the quality in Alice that undid him. A fever had broken out among the laboring families on a distant corner of his estate, the kind of sickness that the gentry generally deal with by sending money and staying well away, and the Duke, riding out to see the trouble for himself as a conscientious landlord should, had arrived to find Alice Wheatley already there, and had been before her for 3 days. She was in the worst of the cottages, her sleeves rolled, nursing a laborer's wife through the crisis of the fever with a steady tenderness that took no notice of the squalor or the danger. She had organized the frightened neighbors, set the half-grown children to useful tasks, brought broth and clean linen from her own home, and made herself, without any fuss or any thought of reward, the calm center of a frightened, stricken place. The Duke stood in the low doorway and watched her, unobserved, for a long moment, and something turned over in him that never turned back. For he was looking at a kind of nobility he had never seen in any drawing-room, the plain, practical courage of a young woman who saw suffering and simply went to help it, at risk to herself, expecting nothing, because it was the right thing to do and there was no one else to do it. He thought, standing there, of the ladies of the tun, who would have fainted at the smell of the place. He thought of the Countess of Stourton, who would have sent a guinea and a footman and considered her duty done, and he thought of this farmer's daughter, who had been nursing the sick of a stranger's family for 3 days because they needed her, and who would have been astonished to be told she had done anything remarkable. And he understood, in that low, dark doorway, that all his life he had been taught to look for nobility in the wrong place, that he had been bred to honor the accident of birth and despise the labor of the hands, when the truth was exactly the other way about, and that the finest, the truly noblest person he had ever met in his life was kneeling in front of him on a dirt floor in a plain stuff gown, wiping the brow of a dying woman she had never met before that week. He never forgot it. And though it would take him months yet, and one bad failure of courage, to act on what he saw in that doorway, he dated his real love for Alice Wheatley from that moment, the moment he saw, past all the lies of his upbringing, exactly what she was. The conversations between the Duke and the farmer's daughter through that long summer were the real substance of their falling in love, and they were unlike any the Duke had ever had in his life. He was used to a particular kind of talk, the careful, calculated, flattering conversation of people who wanted something from him, in which every word was weighed for its effect and no one ever quite said what they meant. Alice did not talk like that, because it had never occurred to her to. She said what she thought, plainly and directly, to the Duke of Inglewood exactly as she would have said it to anyone else, and the experience of being spoken to honestly by someone who wanted nothing from him and was not afraid of him was so novel and so refreshing to the Duke that he found himself seeking it out like a thirsty man seeking water. They talked of everything. They talked of the land, which she understood from the soil up and he only from the rent roll down, and she taught him things about his own estate he had never known. They talked of books, for she had read more than he expected and thought about what she read. They argued about them, vigorously, and she gave no ground merely because he was a duke. They talked of people, and he found her judgments shrewd and charitable and entirely her own. And they laughed, a great deal, for she had a quick, dry humor that punctured his occasional pomposity without malice and left him laughing at himself, which no one had dared to make him do since he was a boy. It was in those conversations that the Duke discovered the man he might have been, underneath the Duke he had been made into. For Alice did not respond to his rank at all. She responded to him, to his mind and his humor and his character, and in responding to those things she called them up, drew them out, made them live. He was wittier with her than with anyone, and kinder and more himself. The stiff, cold magnificence that his position had laid over him like a suit of armor fell away in her company, and underneath it was simply Edward, a clever, decent, lonely man who had been starved half to death for honest human company and had found it, at last, across a farmhouse table. That was what he was really falling in love with, though he did not fully understand it yet, not only with Alice, but with the man he became when he was with her. And that, in the end, is the most dangerous and the most binding love there is. For a man may give up many things, but he will not easily give up the only person in the world who makes him himself. John Wheatley, Alice's father, had his own part to play in the story, and his shrewd, plain, protective good sense was a steadying influence on his daughter through the whole anxious business. He was a man of the soil, John Wheatley, weathered and unhurried, with a slow countryman's way of speaking and a quick countryman's way of judging. And he had not been in the least dazzled when a duke began coming to his farm. Where a meaner or a greedier man might have seen, in the duke's interest in Alice, a glittering chance to be grasped at, John Wheatley saw chiefly a danger to his daughter, and he watched the great man with a wary, level eye, ready to be civil but by no means ready to be impressed. He had no objection to dukes in their place, but his daughter's happiness was worth more to him than all the coronets in England, and he would not have her made a plaything or a scandal for any man living, however grand. When the duke's courage failed and the summer's attentions dwindled into autumn silence, John Wheatley said little, but he marked it, and his opinion of the Duke of Inglewood sank accordingly, for in the farmer's plain code, a man who trifled with a girl's heart and then drew back for fear of what his fine friends would say was no kind of man at all, duke or no duke. But John Wheatley was also a just man, and when the duke came back changed and humbled and honest in his intentions, the farmer gave him a fair hearing, and watched him through the long uphill courtship with the same level eye, and what he saw, in the end, won his hard respect. He saw a man owning his fault and mending it, saw him brave the contempt of his own world for the sake of an honest love, saw him court Alice openly and patiently, and without a particle of the high-handedness the farmer had half expected. And when at last the Duke came to him, man to man, and asked plainly for his daughter's hand, John Wheatley looked at him a long moment, and then gave his blessing in few words but warm ones, that Alice was the best thing he had in the world, and that he had been minded, for a while, to think the Duke not good enough for her, which from a farmer to a duke was a startling thing to say, but that he had come to believe the Duke loved her truly and would use her well, and that being so, he gave her to him gladly, and would be proud to call him son. It was, in its way, as great a compliment as the Duke had ever received, and he had the grace, by then, to know it. Alice's own heart, through that summer, was a more careful thing than the Duke's. For she understood from the very beginning what he was slow to face, that there was a gulf between them the world would never let them cross, and that a farmer's daughter who let herself love a duke was asking to have her heart broken. She was not a fool, and she did not pretend to herself. She knew exactly who she was, and exactly who he was. She knew that dukes did not marry farmers' daughters, that the world would no more permit it than it would permit the sun to rise in the west, and that whatever the Duke of Inglewood might feel for her in the freedom of a country summer, the iron facts of rank would close around him again the moment he returned to his own world. She told herself all this, sensibly and often. And she fell in love with him anyway, because she could not help it, because the man who came so often to her father's farm was not the great Duke of Inglewood, but simply Edward, a lonely, decent, clever man starved of honest company, who listened to her as though her thoughts mattered and laughed with her as though his cares had lifted, and who was, when he forgot to be a duke, the dearest companion she had ever known. She loved him, and she knew it was hopeless, and she guarded the knowledge of it as the most dangerous secret of her life. For Alice had her own pride, and it was every bit as deep as the Duke's. Though it was made of finer stuff, she would not, she resolved, ever let him see that she loved him. She would not throw herself at a man so far above her and make herself ridiculous, and above all, she would never, never consent to be a great man's secret, his country amusement, the shameful nobody he visited in private and would have died before acknowledging in public. She had seen in the way of country people what became of farm girls who let themselves be flattered by their betters, and she would have none of it. If the Duke of Inglewood wanted Alice Wheatley, he could want her honestly and openly, as a man wants a wife, before the whole world, and if he could not bring himself to that, if his rank and his pride were stronger than his heart, then she would bear the loss of him with her head up and her dignity whole, and he should never know what it cost her. She loved him with all her heart, and she was entirely prepared, if it came to it, to give him up sooner than be made small by him. For she knew, as he had not yet learned, that there are worse things than a broken heart, and being someone's hidden shame is one of them. There was one person of high rank who saw the whole situation clearly and without a particle of snobbery, and that was the Duke's grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Inglewood, who became, when the storm broke, Alice's most powerful and most unexpected champion. The Dowager Duchess was a very old lady, well past 80, who had been a great beauty and a great wit in her day, and was now a great power, feared and courted by the whole of society and afraid of no one living. She had buried a husband and a son, had seen 4 reigns and more fashions than she could count, and had arrived, in her great old age, at a magnificent indifference to the opinion of anybody at all. She had also, beneath her formidable manner, more genuine shrewdness and more real kindness than any 10 of the fashionable people who flattered her, for she had lived long enough to learn exactly what the world's distinctions were worth, which was very little, and to value people, in the end, by the only measure that lasts, which is what they are. She had watched her grandson grow up with a clear, affectionate eye, had grieved over the stiffness his rank had bred in him, and had long despaired of his ever marrying anything but a suitable block of ice. And when the rumors of the farmer's daughter reached her, she did not, like the rest of the world, throw up her hands in horror. She grew curious instead, and being a woman who satisfied her curiosity, she came down to Inglewood to see for herself. She met Alice, and the meeting delighted her to the depths of her ancient heart. Here, she saw at once, was no scheming hussy and no simpering nobody, but a young woman of real quality, honest, intelligent, dignified, kind, and possessed of exactly the unbought worth that the old Duchess had spent 80 years learning to recognize and despairing of finding among the painted dolls of the ton. She saw, too, with her shrewd old eyes, that her grandson was head over ears in love with the girl, and that the girl loved him back, and was far too proud to show it, and the Dowager Duchess, who cared nothing for what the Countess of Stourton or anyone else might say, made up her mind on the spot. The boy had found, by some miracle, the one thing she had given up, hoping he would find, a woman worth loving, and if his pride and the world's spite tried to keep him from her, then they would have the Dowager Duchess of Inglewood to reckon with. She had not much time left. She reflected with grim humor, and she could imagine no better use for what remained of her great consequence than to spend it forcing the proud world to accept the best thing that had ever happened to her grandson. The friendship that sprang up between Alice and the old Dowager Duchess, once the 2 women met, was one of the unexpected delights of the whole affair, and it gave Alice, in her loneliest hour, a friend worth an army. They had taken to each other at once, the very old great lady and the young farmer's daughter, recognizing in one another a quality each valued and seldom met, a complete, unbothered honesty, a refusal to pretend. The Dowager Duchess, who had spent 80 years being flattered and feared, was charmed beyond measure to find a young person who treated her with respect but not the smallest servility, who answered her sharp questions with frank good sense, and who was plainly not in the least overawed by her formidable consequence. And Alice, for her part, found in the old Duchess exactly the ally she most needed and least expected, a person of the very highest rank who saw straight through the distinctions of rank to the worth beneath, and who valued Alice for precisely what she was. The old lady would have Alice come and sit with her, and would draw her out, and would deliver herself of 80 years of shrewd and salty observation on the follies of the fashionable world, until Alice was helpless with laughter, and beneath the entertainment there grew a real and deep affection, the affection of a wise old woman at the end of her life, for a fine young one at the beginning of hers. It was the Dowager Duchess, more than anyone, who stiffened Alice's courage at the crisis, just as she had stiffened her grandson's. When Alice, wounded and proud, had half resolved to give the Duke up for his own good, it was the old Duchess who told her with bracing bluntness that she was being a fool, that to throw away a good man's love out of an excess of pride was every bit as great a folly as to throw it away out of cowardice, that the worth of a marriage was not to be measured by what the Countess of Stourton would say about it, and that if Alice loved the boy, and the boy had finally found the courage to love her properly, then the only sensible thing to do was to take him, hold up her head, and let the snobs choke. It was exactly the plain, unsentimental wisdom Alice needed to hear, and from exactly the person whose rank gave it weight, and though Alice came to her own decision, in her own way. The old Duchess's blunt affection was no small part of what gave her the courage, in the end, to let herself be happy. Among all the golden hours of that country summer, there was one in particular that the Duke carried with him ever after, and that came back to him most sharply in the bleak autumn weeks when his courage was failing, for it held, in a single evening, the whole of what he was so nearly fool enough to throw away. It had been the night of the harvest supper at the Wheatley farm, the great feast the farmer gave his laborers when the last of the wheat was safely in, and the Duke, half by accident and half by design, had found himself there, the only gentleman among a barnful of honest country folk making merry after the long labor of the harvest. He had expected, perhaps, to feel out of place. Instead, he had felt, to his own surprise, more at home than he had ever felt in any ballroom in his life. There was no ceremony, no calculation, no cold, appraising eyes. There was only good food and homely ale and rough, kindly laughter, and old songs sung in untrained voices, and the deep, simple contentment of people who had worked hard together and were resting together with the work well done. And at the heart of it, moving among her father's people with an easy grace that needed no title to dignify it, was Alice, laughing, serving, teasing the old men and dancing with the young ones, entirely in her element and entirely lovely. And the Duke had sat in a corner with a mug of country ale in his hand and watched her, and understood, with a quiet certainty that frightened him, that he would rather spend his life in this warm, plain place with this farmer's daughter than in all the cold palaces of his own world. That was the memory that came back to torment him. Later, when he had let the silence fall and was trying to persuade himself that he could live without her, he would think of the harvest supper, of the firelight and the laughter and Alice at the heart of it, and he would measure it against the chill, correct splendor of the life his rank prescribed for him, the suitable wife and the suitable friends and the suitable joyless years stretching ahead. And the comparison would shame him and torment him and at last help to wake him. For he had tasted, in that barn, a happiness he had not known existed, the happiness of being among people who were real and warm and unafraid, of being loved for himself and not his rank, and a man who has once tasted that and knows where it is to be found cannot easily reconcile himself to going hungry for the rest of his life merely to please a world he does not even respect. The harvest supper had shown him heaven. It only remained for him to find the courage to claim it. The summer could not last forever, and when it ended, and the Duke was called back to his own world and his own duties, the war between his heart and his pride broke out in earnest, and for a time To his lasting shame, his pride had the upper hand. It is one thing to love a farmer's daughter in the golden freedom of a country summer, where no one of one's own world is watching. It is another to carry that love back into the cold light of the tun, and own it before the people whose opinion has ruled one's whole life. The Duke returned to society, and society closed around him again like cold water, and all the old assumptions he had let slip in the country rose up to reclaim him. He heard, in every drawing-room, the unspoken expectations of his rank. He saw the suitable young ladies paraded before him. He felt the whole vast weight of 300 years of dukes who had married as dukes should, and the unthinkable enormity of what it would mean for the Duke of Inglewood to marry a farmer's daughter, the scandal, the ridicule, the horror of his family, the lifted eyebrows of a world that would never, ever let either of them forget it. And under that weight, his courage failed him. He did not stop loving Alice. He could not. But he began, in his own mind, to treat that love as an impossibility, a sweet summer madness that a sensible man must put behind him, and he began, God forgive him, to think of her not as the woman he must marry, but as a thing he must give up. He was wretched. Of course, a man does not strangle his own heart without paying for it, but he was also, in those weeks, something worse than wretched. He was a coward. He let the silence between them grow. He did not go to her, did not write, did not declare himself. He let the autumn pass in a miserable indecision, telling himself he was being sensible, telling himself the gulf was simply too wide, telling himself 100 comfortable lies to cover the single ugly truth, which was that he was afraid. He was afraid of what the world would say. He, the Duke of Inglewood, who feared no man living, was afraid of the lifted eyebrow and the whispered sneer, and he was prepared, because of that fear, to break his own heart and Alice's together, and to let the finest thing his life had ever offered him slip away, sooner than face the disapproval of people he did not even respect. It was the lowest point of his life, though he did not yet know it, and it would take a hard shock to wake him from it. It is worth understanding just how heavy the weight was that pressed on the Duke when he returned to his own world, for it explains, though it does not excuse, the failure of nerve that so nearly cost him everything. A man raised as the Duke of Inglewood had been raised does not carry his rank as a coat he can take off. He carries it as a skin he was born in. From his earliest memory he had been taught that he was different, set apart, the bearer of a great name with great obligations, that the choices of a duke were never merely his own, but belonged to his house, his line, the 300 years of Inglewoods behind him and the centuries of Inglewoods to come, and that to marry beneath his rank was not a private folly, but a kind of treason against all of them, a staining of the blood, a betrayal of the trust handed down to him. None of this had ever been argued to him. It had simply been the water he swam in, the unexamined ground of his whole existence. And when he carried his summer love back into the cold air of the tun, all of it came flooding back with a force he had not reckoned on. The disapproving ghosts of his ancestors, the certain horror of his living relations, the absolute conviction of his entire world that such a marriage was simply impossible, unthinkable, not to be done. That is why his courage failed, for a time as it did. It was not that he loved Alice the less, it was that he was fighting, almost alone, against the entire weight of his upbringing and his world, and the weight was very great. A lesser love would have been crushed by it altogether, and many a man in his position has let exactly such a weight crush exactly such a love, and married his suitable duchess, and been quietly unhappy for the rest of his life, and called it duty. The Duke of Inglewood came within a hair's breadth of being one of those men. What saved him was partly his grandmother's plain speaking, and partly the memory of Alice in that fever cottage, and partly, in the end, a stubborn core of honesty in him that would not let him go on lying to himself. But it was a near thing, and he knew it was a near thing, and the knowledge of how close he had come to throwing away his happiness for the sake of mere pride humbled him, rightly, for the rest of his days. It is easy to despise his weakness from the comfortable distance of a fireside. It was a great deal harder to stand where he stood, with the whole world telling him he was right to be a coward, and choose, against all of it, to be brave. The shock that woke him came from his grandmother, and it came in the form of a few blunt words that cut through the comfortable fog of his cowardice, and showed him, all at once, exactly what he was, and exactly what he stood to lose. The Dowager Duchess had watched her grandson's miserable indecision with mounting impatience, and at last, when she could bear it no longer, she summoned him and spoke her mind. She did not spare him. She told him that she had met Alice Wheatley, and that the girl was worth 100 of the painted dolls he was being urged to marry. That she had seen the two of them together, and knew perfectly well that he loved the girl and the girl loved him, and that he was, in consequence, on the point of committing the single greatest folly of his life, which was to throw away a true and living love for the sake of the good opinion of a pack of fools. And then she said the thing that went home. She told him that she had lived more than 80 years and buried nearly everyone she had ever loved, and learned in the end that almost everything the world counts important is worth nothing at all, and that the only things that matter, when one comes to the close of it, are the people one has loved and the courage one has shown. And that she would rather see him marry his farmer's daughter and be happy and brave than marry a duchess and be miserable and a coward, and that if he let this girl go to please the Countess of Stourton, he would regret it on his deathbed, as she had seen better men than he regret the loves they had been too craven to claim. The words struck the Duke like cold water in the face, and they woke him. For he heard, in his grandmother's blunt old voice, the truth he had been hiding from himself for weeks, and once heard it could not be unheard. He had been a coward. He had been preparing to sacrifice the best thing in his life, not to any real duty, but to mere vanity, to the fear of what hollow people would say. And he saw, suddenly and with burning clarity, how contemptible that was, and how small, and how unworthy of the love Alice had given him and the man he wished to be. The fog of his cowardice burned away, and behind it stood the simple truth his heart had known all summer and his pride had buried, that he loved Alice Wheatley, that her worth had nothing to do with her birth, and his honor had nothing to do with the Countess of Stourton's opinion, that true nobility is a thing of the character and not of the blood, and that a man who would let 300 years of dead dukes frighten him out of a living love did not deserve to be called a man at all. He had been on the point of the greatest mistake of his life. He was not, he resolved in that hour, going to make it. But the Duke's awakening had come at a price, for his weeks of cowardly silence had not gone unnoticed by Alice, and when he came at last to claim her, he found that his own delay had raised a barrier between them that his rank never could. For Alice had felt the change in him the moment the summer ended. She had watched him withdraw into his own world, had felt the warmth go out of him as the silence stretched, had understood, with the bleak, clear sight of a proud heart preparing itself for pain, exactly what was happening, that the Duke of Inglewood, back among his own kind, was thinking better of his country madness, and was going to do what she had always known he would do, and let her go. She had braced herself for it. She had told herself she had always expected it, that it was no more than sense, that she would bear it. But it had wounded her more deeply than she let anyone see, and it had wounded her not because he had drawn back, which she had foreseen, but because of the cowardly manner of it, the silence, the not coming, the leaving her to understand by his absence what he had not the courage to say to her face. She had thought better of him than that. She had believed that whatever else happened, Edward would be honest with her, and his weeks of craven silence had taught her, painfully, that his pride was stronger than his honesty, and that she had perhaps loved a man who did not quite exist. so that when the Duke came at last, his cowardice burned away and his heart full of everything he meant to say, he found in Alice he was not prepared for, not the warm open girl of the summer, but a quiet, guarded, gravely dignified young woman who received him with a cool composure that stopped him in his tracks. She had spent the autumn rebuilding the walls his summer kindness had coaxed down, and she did not mean to let them down again easily. She had been hurt, and she had her pride, and she was not, she had resolved, going to fall gratefully into the arms of a man who had spent 2 months deciding whether she was good enough for him, merely because he had finally, graciously, concluded that she was. The Duke had imagined, in his new resolve, that he had only to go to Alice and declare himself, and all would be well. He discovered instead that having once let her believe he was ashamed of her, he had a long, hard road to travel before she would trust her heart to him again, and that a proud woman who has been made to feel small does not forget it merely because the man who made her feel so has changed his mind. The Duke's efforts to win back Alice's trust, once his courage had returned, were humbling and often clumsy, for he was learning, at 33, a lesson he should have learned long before, that some things cannot be commanded, but only earned. He had imagined, in the first flush of his resolve, that the hard part was over, that having conquered his own pride, he had only to go to Alice and lay his heart before her and be joyfully received. He was quickly disabused. He found her, when he came, courteous but cool, gravely guarded, no longer the warm open companion of the summer, and he understood slowly and painfully that his weeks of cowardly silence had done a damage that a single ardent speech could not undo. She did not trust him. She had let down her walls once, in the freedom of the summer, and had been wounded for it, and she was not about to let them down again merely because the Duke had changed his mind and come back. He had taught her, by his silence, that his pride could overrule his heart, and now he had to teach her, by his constancy, that it would never do so again. And that was not a lesson that could be taught in a day. So he set himself to court her properly, for the first time, and to court her uphill. He came to the farm openly now, in the daylight, caring nothing who saw. He sought her father's good opinion, man to man, and won the shrewd old farmer's cautious respect. He bore Alice's coolness without complaint, and her occasional flashes of remembered hurt without resentment, knowing he had earned them. He did not press her, or plead, or try to hurry her heart. He had learned the folly of trying to command what must be freely given. He simply kept coming, steadily, humbly, day after day, proving by his constancy what his words alone could not prove, that he was changed, that he was not ashamed of her and never would be again, and that he meant, this time, to stand by her against the whole world. It was slow work, and it cost his pride a great deal, and it was the best thing he had ever done, for a man who has never had to earn anything is improved beyond measure by being made, at last, to earn the only thing that matters. The county, when the news of the Duke's intentions began to spread, divided exactly along the line that divides the generous from the mean. And the way people took the news was a fair test of what each of them was made of. The grand folk, the people of rank and fashion who took their cue from the Countess of Stourton, were uniformly scandalized. The thing was an outrage, a betrayal of their whole order, a duke demeaning himself and his name by stooping to a creature from the dirt, they said so freely, in tones of horror and contempt, and competed with one another in the severity of their disapproval, as though the duke's choice were a personal affront to each of them. That a man should marry for love rather than for rank struck them as not merely foolish, but almost indecent, a flouting of the natural order on which their whole comfortable sense of their own superiority depended, and they closed ranks against Alice with the instinctive cruelty of a privileged class defending its borders against an intruder. But the common people, the farmers and laborers and tradesmen and servants who made up the great unregarded mass of the county, took the news altogether differently, for they knew Alice Wheatley, and they loved her, and they were delighted. To them it was the finest story they had heard in years, one of their own, a good girl from a good family, lifted up to be a duchess by a duke with the sense to see her worth. They did not feel, as the gentry felt, that the natural order was being outraged. They felt that it was, for once, being gloriously set right, that merit was being rewarded over mere birth, and that there was hope in the world after all if a farmer's daughter could become a duchess by being good and true. The Wheatley's neighbors rejoiced. The Duke's tenants were beside themselves with pride that their master should marry one of their own, and there was more honest happiness over the match in the cottages of the Inglewood estate than in all the drawing-rooms of the ton put together. It was, when you considered it, a fair verdict on the two halves of the world, the proud half appalled that worth should triumph over rank, and the humble half rejoicing that, for once, it had. The Countess of Stourton's snobbery is worth pausing on, not to excuse it, but to understand it. For there is a kind of cruelty that springs not from strength, but from a hidden emptiness. And the Countess's was of that kind. She had built her entire self upon rank. Strip away her title, her precedence, her position at the head of the fashionable world, and there was nothing left of the Countess of Stourton at all, for she had never, in her whole life, cultivated a single quality that did not depend on her station. She had no learning that she valued for its own sake, no art, no charity, no warmth, no inner resource of any kind. She had only her rank, and the deference it commanded, and these had become, by long habit, the whole substance of her sense of who she was. And that, precisely, was why she hated Alice Wheatley with such a venom. For Alice was living proof of the one thing the Countess could not afford to believe, which was that a person's worth has nothing to do with their rank at all. If a farmer's daughter could be finer than a countess, then the countess's whole life was founded on a lie, and her cherished superiority was an illusion, and she herself was revealed as the hollow thing she secretly feared she was. She could not bear it. The very existence of a good and admirable nobody was an attack on everything she was, and so she struck at Alice not merely from ambition for her daughter, but from a deep and frightened need to crush the living evidence that rank and worth were not the same thing. It is a sobering thing to understand, for it is the secret of a great deal of cruelty in this world. The people who most fiercely insist on their own superiority are very often the people who least securely possess any real worth of their own. They cling to the outward marks of rank precisely because they have nothing inward to fall back on, and they savage those who threaten that outward distinction because it is, quite literally, all they have. The Countess of Stourton was a powerful and a frightening woman, and she did Alice real harm. But she was, underneath her cold magnificence, a poor and empty creature, far more to be pitied than envied, and Alice, who came in the end to understand her, did pity her, a little, even as she defeated her. For Alice had the one thing the Countess of Stourton would have given her whole title to possess, and could not buy at any price, a worth that was her own, that no one had given her and no one could take away, and that needed no coronet to make it real. The slow thawing of Alice's guarded heart as the Duke courted her honestly through that difficult autumn was a quiet drama all its own, and it cost her quite as much courage to let her walls down again as it had cost her to raise them. She had not meant to forgive him easily, and she did not. She had been hurt too deeply for that, and her pride, once roused in self-defense, was not a thing she could lower at will. But she watched him, through those weeks, with a wary attention that missed nothing, and what she saw, slowly, against her own resistance, began to undo her careful resolution. She saw that he came openly now, in the daylight, with no more hiding and no more shame, that he sought her out before the very people he had once been afraid of, that he bore her coolness without sulking and her flashes of remembered anger, without excusing himself, taking his medicine, as it were, like a man who knew he had earned it. She saw him win her father's grudging respect by honest dealing, and treat her mother with a courtesy that had no condescension in it, and speak to the farm folk as though they were people and not furniture. And she saw, above all, that the change in him was not a mood, but a conversion, that the man courting her now was not the half-hearted lover who had let the summer's silence fall, but someone steadier and humbler and more holy himself, a man who had looked into his own cowardice and come out the other side. And slowly, against her will, the walls came down. It is a frightening thing to trust again where one has been wounded, and Alice was not a woman who did it lightly, but she was also not a woman who would let an old hurt blind her to a present good. And the evidence of the Duke's constancy mounted, week by week, until she could no longer honestly doubt it. She began to soften toward him, began to let the warmth back into her manner, began, cautiously, to hope. She never told him, in so many words, when she forgave him, there was no single moment of melting, no scene of reconciliation. There was only the slow, sure, daily proof of a good man being steadfast, and the answering, reluctant, irresistible return of a good woman's trust. And somewhere in the gray heart of that autumn, without either of them quite marking the day, Alice Wheatley let herself love the Duke of Inglewood again, openly this time, and without fear. While the Duke was painfully learning to win back the trust he had thrown away, the Countess of Stourton, who had at last confirmed the rumor to her own horror, moved to crush the farmer's daughter once and for all, and her campaign brought matters to their crisis. The Countess had come down from town in a cold fury the moment she was sure the thing was real. That the Duke of Inglewood, whom she had marked for her own daughter, should be entangled with a farmer's daughter was an outrage she found literally insupportable, and she set herself to end it with all the considerable weight of her position and all the cold cruelty of her nature. She could not, of course, attack the Duke directly, but she could attack the girl, and she did, with a snobbish ferocity that stopped at nothing. She saw to it that Alice was snubbed and slighted and excluded wherever the Countess's influence reached. She spread it about the county, in tones of pretended pity, that the Wheatley girl was a scheming hussy who had thrown herself at the Duke and was angling shamelessly for a coronet far above her station. She worked on the Duke's family and connections, playing on exactly the snobbish horror the Duke had so nearly given way to, and she made it brutally plain, in every way open to her, that if the Duke of Inglewood persisted in his madness, she would see to it that both he and his low-born bride were made the laughing-stock of the whole of society. But it was her cruelty to Alice herself that did the real damage, and it was calculated to wound where Alice was proudest. The Countess contrived a meeting, and said to Alice's face, with the sweet poisoned condescension of a great lady crushing an inferior, all the things she most wanted the girl to feel, that she was a nobody reaching grotesquely above herself, that the Duke could never truly mean to marry her and was only amusing himself, that even if by some madness he did, she would be despised and shut out and miserable for the rest of her life, a farmer's daughter playing at being a duchess, a standing joke, and that the kindest thing she could do, for herself and for the Duke she claimed to care for, was to take herself back to her farmyard where she belonged and stop dragging a great man down. It was masterfully done, every word aimed at a fear Alice already harbored in her own proud heart, and it struck home, for the Countess had given voice, with deliberate cruelty, to the very doubt that Alice's own dignity had been whispering to her all along, that to marry the Duke would be to spend her life as an unwelcome intruder in a world that would never accept her, and to be the cause of his lifelong humiliation. And Alice, already wounded by his silence and now poisoned by the Countess's cruelty, began to believe that the only dignified thing left to her was to give him up. The meeting the Countess contrived with Alice, and the way Alice bore it, is worth setting down in full, for it was the cruelest thing done to her in the whole affair, and she met it with a dignity that would have shamed a duchess. The Countess had arranged it cleverly, sending for Alice on a pretext. so that the girl came to the great house expecting some ordinary matter of business and found herself, instead, alone with the most powerful and most hostile woman in the county. And then the Countess had set to work. She had not raised her voice, that was not her way. She had been, on the surface, all cool civility, the great lady graciously condescending to set a foolish girl right. And underneath the civility she had driven in, one after another, with exquisite precision, every cruel truth and half-truth calculated to break Alice's spirit. She had spoken of the impossibility of the match, the certainty of the Duke's eventual regret, the lifetime of contempt and exclusion that awaited any farmer's daughter mad enough to marry above her station, she had painted. In cold, convincing detail, the picture of Alice as a perpetual embarrassment, a standing joke, a millstone round the neck of the man she claimed to love, and she had ended by appealing, with poisonous sweetness, to Alice's own love for the Duke, urging that the truly generous thing, the truly noble thing, would be for Alice to release him for his own good. And Alice had borne it all without flinching. She had stood very straight, and listened to the whole cruel speech in silence, and let nothing of the pain it caused her show in her steady face, and when the Countess had finished, Alice had answered her, quietly and with perfect dignity, in words the Countess did not soon forget. She had said that she was sorry the Countess thought so ill of her, but that she could not agree that worth was a matter of birth, that she had been raised to believe a person was to be judged by their character and their conduct, and that she had seen nothing in her life to make her change that belief, least of all today, and that whatever she decided about the Duke, she would decide for honest reasons of her own, and not because a great lady had been at the pains to be cruel to her. And then she had curtsied, with a composure the Countess could not ruffle, and taken her leave, and walked out of that great house with her head high, and it was only when she was alone, on the long road home, that she let herself weep, not for the insults, which she despised, but for the dreadful possibility that the cruel woman might, after all, be right. The nights that followed the Countess's cruelty were the hardest of Alice's life, and the reasoning by which she talked herself toward giving the Duke up is worth following, for it shows a generous heart turning its own goodness into a weapon against itself. She lay awake, those nights, turning the thing over and over, and the worst of it was that she could not simply dismiss the Countess's words as malice, for she knew that much of what the cruel woman had said was true. It was true that the world would never accept her. It was true that she would be, in the eyes of the ton, a perpetual misfit at the head of the Duke's great table. It was true that the Duke, for all his present ardor, would have to bear, for the rest of his life, the whispers and the slights and the lifted eyebrows that came of having married beneath him, and it was true, or at least it might be true, that the love which burned so bright now might one day gutter under that endless cold drought and leave him regretting, in some gray future, the proud choice of his foolish youth. Alice loved him, and it was precisely because she loved him that the Countess's poison worked so well, for a selfish woman would have grasped at the coronet and let the Duke look to himself. But Alice could not bear the thought of being the cause, however innocent, of his unhappiness, and the more she loved him, the more it seemed to her that the loving thing, the noble thing, the only thing a truly good woman could do, was to set him free. It was, of course, a kind of trap, though Alice was too deep in her own pain to see it clearly. The Countess had taken Alice's finest qualities, her love, her generosity, her humility, her care for the Duke's good above her own, and had twisted them with diabolical skill into reasons for Alice to destroy her own happiness, had made Alice's very goodness the instrument of her defeat. For there was a flaw in the noble reasoning, which a less wounded woman might have seen. It assumed that the Duke could not judge his own happiness, that he did not know his own mind, that he needed Alice to make his sacrifice for him because he was too blinded by love to make the sensible choice himself. It was, beneath its generosity, a kind of presumption. the presumption of deciding another person's good for them. And it took the Duke himself, in the end, to point this out to her, and to insist, with a new and welcome firmness, that the choice of whom he married and what he was willing to bear for her was his to make and not hers. But Alice could not see that yet. She saw only that she loved him, and that loving him seemed to require giving him up, and in the small hours of those hard nights. She made up her mind to do it, and so Alice Wheatley made the hardest decision of her life, and resolved to refuse the Duke of Inglewood, and to send away with her own hand the only man she had ever loved. She came to it honestly, and for the best of reasons, which made it no easier to bear. She had turned the Countess's cruel words over in the long nights, and had found in them, stripped of their malice, a core of bitter truth she could not argue away. It was true that the world would never accept her. It was true that to marry the Duke would be to make him, in the eyes of his whole world, a man who had thrown himself away, that she would be a perpetual embarrassment to him, a farmer's daughter at the head of his great table, a thing for the tongue to sneer at forever. And that the love which felt so right in the freedom of the country might curdle, under the long acid drip of the world's contempt, into something he would come to regret. She loved him far too well to do that to him, and she had her own pride, too, which could not bear the thought of a lifetime spent as an unwelcome intruder, tolerated for her husband's sake, never accepted, always a little despised. Better, she thought, to end it cleanly now, while it was still only her own heart that would break, than to drag them both into a marriage the world would never let them be happy in. So when the Duke came to her, as she knew he would, with his pride conquered at last and his heart in his hands and an honest, ardent offer of marriage on his lips, Alice did the bravest and most heartbreaking thing she had ever done. She refused him. She told him, steadily and without tears, that she was deeply sensible of the honor he did her, and that she would not for the world be the ruin of him, that a marriage between them could bring him nothing but scandal and regret, that he belonged to a world she could never enter and would only shame, and that she begged him, for his own sake and for hers, to put aside his summer madness and let her go back to the life she was fitted for. She said it well, and she meant every word, and it cost her everything she had, and she waited, with her heart breaking behind her steady face, for the Duke to be sensible and to be grateful and to go. What it cost the Duke to hear his offer refused, and the way his answer rose to meet it, marked the exact moment he became, at last, wholly the man Alice had always believed he could be. He had come to her that day with his whole heart in his hands, expecting, after his weeks of patient courtship, that the worst was behind him, and to hear her refuse him, steadily and finally telling him she would not be his ruin and begging him to let her go, was a blow he had not braced for. For one terrible moment the old despair rose in him, for it seemed that his early cowardice had done its work too well, had taught her to doubt him so deeply that even now, even with his pride conquered and his heart laid bare, she would not have him. But the despair did not last, because as he looked at her pale, steady face and her two bright eyes, and the visible effort it cost her to say the words, he understood that she was not refusing him because she did not love him, but because she loved him too well, that this was not indifference but sacrifice, and that the hand behind it, twisting her own goodness against her, was the hand of the Countess of Stourton. And at that understanding, something hardened in the Duke, in the best possible way. The man who, a few months before, had let the Countess's world frighten him into silence, found in himself now a cold, clear anger that would not be moved, for he saw exactly what had been done to the woman he loved, and he would not permit it. He would not, this time, let pride or fear or the cruelty of others rob them both of their happiness. And he would not, above all, let Alice's own generosity be turned into the instrument of her defeat. He refused her refusal, gently but absolutely. He told her that he saw the Countess's handiwork plainly, and would not let it stand, that the decision of what he was willing to bear for love was his to make and not hers, and that he had made it, that he had been a coward once, and would die before he was a coward again, and that he loved her, and would have her, and meant to prove it to her and to the whole watching world in a manner none of them would ever forget. It was the speech of a man who has finally found his courage and his footing both at once, and Alice, hearing it, knew that the Edward she had loved and feared she had imagined was real after all, and standing before her and hers. But the Duke of Inglewood did not go, and he was not sensible, and the refusal that would once have been his cowardly escape became, now that his courage had returned, the very thing that steeled him to fight. For he understood, as Alice spoke, exactly what was being done to her and by whom. He heard her out, and he saw straight through her noble reasons to the wound beneath them. He knew Alice. He knew she did not speak from indifference, but from a breaking heart, and he recognized in the careful catalogue of reasons she gave him the unmistakable poison of the Countess of Stourton, whose handiwork he had been hearing of all over the county. And the understanding did not crush him, as it would have a month before. It made him angry, with the clean, useful anger of a man who has finally found something worth fighting for. He refused to accept her refusal. He told her, with a quiet force she had never heard from him before, that he knew exactly where her fine reasons had come from, and that he would not let the cruelty of a snobbish woman do what his own cowardice had so nearly done, and rob them both of their happiness. He told her that he had been a coward, and that he was ashamed of it, and that he would spend his life making up for the weeks he had let her doubt him, but that he was a coward no longer, and that he loved her and meant to marry her, and did not care a snap of his fingers for the opinion of the Countess of Stourton or the whole ton put together. And then he made her a promise that changed everything. He would not, he said, marry her in a corner, quietly, as though there were anything to be ashamed of. That was the very thing the Countess counted on, that they would creep into a hole and corner match the world could despise. No, he would marry her openly, proudly, before the whole of that glittering, cruel world, and he would make them accept her, not as a duke's embarrassing folly, but as his honored and beloved wife and the finest woman in the room. He would take her, he said, to the grandest occasion of the season, to the Countess of Stourton's own ball, the very heart of the world that scorned her, and there, before the assembled ton, he would lead her out to dance as the future Duchess of Inglewood, and let the Countess of Stourton and all her kind choke on it. He did not ask Alice to be brave for him. He had been brave for no one, and the shame of it had taught him. He asked her only to trust him one more time, and to let him show the world, and her, the man he should have been from the first. And Alice, looking into his changed and resolute face, found that she believed him, and the walls she had built came down for the last time. It should not be supposed that the Duke's courage cost him nothing beyond the conquering of his own pride, for once his intentions were known, his own family and connections rose against the match almost to a man, and he had to face their opposition down before ever he faced the Countess of Stourton's. His relations were horrified, and said so. Aunts and uncles and cousins who had taken little enough notice of him for years descended upon him now in a body, full of grave warnings and shocked remonstrance, painting in lurid colors the disgrace he was about to bring upon the ancient name of Inglewood. He was reminded at length of his duty to his house, of the 300 years of suitable marriages behind him, of the horror with which his late father would have regarded such a connection, of the ridicule he would draw down upon them all. One formidable aunt, a great stickler for rank, went so far as to tell him to his face that she would never receive a farmer's daughter as her niece, and that he might choose between his low-born bride and the regard of his own family. It was the kind of pressure that had broken his nerve once before, applied now with the full force of family feeling and family duty, and a weaker man, or the man the Duke had been a few months earlier, might well have buckled under it again. But the Duke did not buckle, and the way he met his family's opposition showed how completely he was changed. He heard them out with perfect courtesy, and then he answered them with a quiet, immovable firmness that left them nothing to argue with. He told them that he was sorry to grieve them, but that the choice of his wife was his own to make. That he had found a woman of more real worth than any his family was likely to offer him, and that he intended to marry her, and that any relation who could not receive his wife with the respect due to the Duchess of Inglewood was at perfect liberty to stay away, and would not be missed. To the formidable aunt who had offered him the choice between his bride and his family, he replied, with a gentleness more crushing than any anger, that if those were indeed the terms, then he chose his bride, and was sorry to lose the aunt. It was said so simply and so finally that the opposition collapsed, for there is no arguing with a man who has counted the cost of his courage and found it worth paying. One by one, grumbling, the relations gave way, and those who had sworn they would never receive the farmer's daughter found themselves, within a year, competing for invitations to her table. The plan to claim Alice at the Countess of Stourton's own ball was hatched between the Duke and his grandmother, and it bore the unmistakable stamp of the old dowager's relish for a battle nobly won. The Duke had been clear, once his mind was made up, that he would not marry Alice quietly. To slip her into a hole-and-corner wedding, far from the eyes of the world, would have been to concede, by his very secrecy, that there was something in the match to be ashamed of, and that was the one thing he was now determined never again to concede. If he was to marry a farmer's daughter, he would do it in the full blaze of the world's attention. With his head high, he would make the ton accept her, not creep around its disapproval, and he would answer the sneers of people like the Countess of Stourton, not with apology, but with a defiance so complete that it left them nothing to say. The question was only how best to do it, and it was the Dowager Duchess who supplied the answer, with the wicked delight of a veteran general spotting the perfect ground for a decisive engagement. "Let it be done," she said, "at the Countess of Stourton's own ball. Nothing could be more fitting." The Countess had set herself up as the high priestess of all the snobbery that stood between Alice and her happiness. She had schemed to crush the girl and to secure the Duke for her own cold daughter, and it would be a stroke of poetic justice past praying for to make her own grand ball, the proudest gathering of her year, the very stage on which her schemes were publicly and irrevocably overthrown. The Dowager would see to it that Alice was there, on her own protecting arm. The Duke would be the guest of honor, as the greatest man invited always is, and there, in front of the whole assembled world that the Countess had gathered to admire her own consequence, the Duke would lead the farmer's daughter out to dance and claim her as his bride, and there would be nothing the Countess could do but stand in her own ballroom and endure it. The Duke heard the plan, and saw at once how perfect it was, and how completely it answered every requirement of his honor and his love. And grandson and grandmother set about arranging it together with a shared and unholy glee. What the night of the ball was like for Alice herself, walking into that blaze of hostile splendor on the arm of an old duchess to be claimed before 1,000 sneering eyes, was an ordeal whose courage no one but she ever fully measured. She had not wanted to go. The thought of walking, a farmer's daughter in plain muslin, into the most exclusive ballroom in England, to be stared at and whispered over and sneered at by the very people who most despised her, was enough to daunt a far bolder spirit than she would have claimed to possess. It was only her trust in the Duke, hard won and newly restored, and the bracing company of the old Dowager Duchess, that carried her up those great steps at all. And the reality, when she entered, was every bit as bad as she had feared. The sudden hush, the turning heads, the lifted glasses, and the murmured comments behind fans, the cold appraising stares of a room full of people united in the conviction that she had no business breathing their rarefied air. For one dreadful moment, hearing the Countess's carrying voice demand who had let the farmer's daughter in, she felt the old country girl's instinct to shrink, to apologize for her existence, to flee from a place so plainly not meant for her. And then she did not. for she remembered, in that moment, who she was and how she had been raised, remembered her father's voice telling her never to bow her head to any man merely because he was grander than herself, remembered that she had nursed the dying and run a farm and done 100 honest things not one of these glittering people could have managed, and remembered, above all, that she had done nothing wrong, nothing to be ashamed of, nothing but love a good man and be loved by him in return. So she lifted her head, and she stood her ground, and she let them stare, and when the Duke came across the floor to her and bowed and held out his hand, she put her work-honored hand into his and let him lead her out to dance, with a composure that came not from any drawing-master, but from the deep, unshakable knowledge of her own worth. She did not own that room by being grander than the people in it. She could never be that, and would not have wished to be. She owned it by being, simply and unmistakably and before them all, a woman of real quality, who knew her own value and needed no one's permission to stand among them, and more than one honest heart in that proud assembly, watching Alice dance with her Duke, felt a sudden shame at having ever thought her beneath them. The old Dowager Duchess of Inglewood enjoyed the night of the ball more thoroughly than she had enjoyed anything in 20 years, and her part in the rout of the Countess of Stourton was, by her own cheerful account, considerable. It was she who had made certain that Alice came to the ball at all, and came armored in the only protection that mattered, which was the visible support of the highest rank. The Dowager Duchess outranked the Countess of Stourton, and had outlived and outwitted 3 generations of her betters, and feared her not in the slightest, and she had taken a fierce old lady's delight in arriving at the Countess's exclusive ball with the despised farmer's daughter on her own arm, daring anyone present to offer the girl an insult under the eye of the most formidable dowager in England. It was a shield Alice could not have provided for herself, and it changed the whole character of the evening, for an insult to a nobody is one thing, but an insult to the chosen companion of the Dowager Duchess of Inglewood was a thing few even of the boldest snobs dared to risk. And when the moment came, and her grandson led the farmer's daughter out to dance and announced his betrothal to the silenced room, no one in that ballroom enjoyed the Countess of Stourton's discomfiture more than the old Duchess. She had no love for the Countess, whom she considered a cold, vulgar, jumped-up creature for all her rank. And to watch that proud woman forced to stand in her own ballroom and swallow the triumph of the very nobody she had tried to crush was, to the Dowager Duchess, as good as a play. She made her own approval of the match blazingly plain, took Alice about the room on her arm and presented her, with pointed graciousness, to everyone whose opinion mattered, and dared the assembled ton, by her every word and look, to find fault with her grandson's choice. The tide turned that night, as the Dowager had known it would, for the world follows the lead of the great, and the greatest lady in the room had declared herself unmistakably on the side of the farmer's daughter, and the old Duchess went home that night well satisfied, having done as she said, the best evening's work of her old age, and she took, ever afterward and with perfect justice, the entire credit for the whole affair. And so we come back at last to the ball, and to the moment we began with, and now you know what the Countess of Stourton did not, as she stood in her own glittering ballroom and demanded to know who had let the farmer's daughter in. The Duke had planned it with care, for he meant it to be unanswerable. He had secured Alice's invitation through his grandmother, the Dowager Duchess, who had taken up the cause of the match with all the relish of a great old lady who feared nobody and loved a fight. And the two of them, the Duke and the Dowager, had agreed that the Countess of Stourton's own ball, the proudest and most exclusive gathering of the season, was the perfect ground on which to settle the matter forever. So Alice came to the ball, gowned with quiet good taste at the Dowager Duchess's insistence, but wearing no borrowed grandeur, simply herself, and she came on the arm of the formidable old Duchess, which was a shield the Countess could not lightly strike through. and she stepped into that blaze of light and music as the one truly honest person in the room. The Countess saw her, and could not at first believe the effrontery of it, and then, her cold fury overcoming even her breeding, she demanded, in that carrying voice, who had let Alice in. What followed, the tone talked of for years. For the Duke of Inglewood, who had been watching for exactly this moment, crossed the floor at once, in the sight of the whole assembly, and answered the Countess's question with his deeds instead of his words. He went straight to Alice and bowed to her with a deep and deliberate respect that he had shown to no one else that evening, not excepting his hostess, and he led her out, the farmer's daughter, into the very center of the floor, and opened the dancing with her before the assembled eyes of the proudest people in England. And then, when the dance was done and the whole room was straining to see and hear, he kept her hand in his and turned to the company and announced, in a voice that carried to every corner of that silenced room, that Miss Alice Wheatley had done him the very great honor of consenting to become his wife, and that he counted himself the most fortunate man in England. The Countess of Stourton, who had demanded to know who let the girl in, had her answer in full at last, delivered before her own assembled guests in her own ballroom. The Duke of Inglewood had let her in, and meant to make her a duchess. And there was not one thing the Countess of Stourton could do about it but stand and watch. The faces in that ballroom, in the long-charged moment after the Duke's announcement, were a study worth recording, for they showed the whole spectrum of how human beings meet the defeat of their own meanness. The Countess of Stourton's face was the most instructive of all. For a single instant, before her iron breeding clamped down, it showed everything: the disbelief, the fury, the bitter understanding that she had been comprehensively and publicly beaten, on her own ground, before her own guests, by the very nobody she had been so sure of crushing. She had gathered the proudest people in England to admire her consequence, and they had been made, instead, the witnesses of her overthrow, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing, that she could do about it, for to make a scene would be to lose what little dignity remained to her, and to acquiesce was gall and wormwood. She chose, in the end, the only course open to a great lady caught in such a trap. She fixed a frozen smile upon her face, and inclined her head a frozen inch, and said the cold congratulations that the moment demanded, and hated every syllable of them. And her daughter, Lady Augusta, stood beside her, the great match of the season slipping forever out of her grasp, and learned in that public moment the bitter lesson that all her birth and beauty and accomplishment had not been able to win her what an unaccomplished farmer's daughter had won by simply being worth the winning. But not every face in that room was sour. Here and there among the glittering crowd were people of sense and heart who had never quite swallowed the Countess's cruelty, and who watched the farmer's daughter dance with her duke and felt something stir in them that did them credit, a reluctant admiration, a dawning shame at their own former contempt, a quiet gladness to see worth honored over rank for once in their narrow world. And the servants, ranged silent and decorous around the walls, the footmen and the maids who were themselves of Alice's own people, watched the whole scene with a fierce secret joy they dared not show, and carried the story back to the servants' hall that night, and from there out into the whole county, where it was told and retold by the firesides of the poor for many a long winter to come, the night Alice was made a duchess, and the proudest lady in England had to stand and watch. The marriage that followed was the union of two people who had each been tested and had each in the end proved true, and it was the happier for everything it had cost them to reach it. They were married, as the Duke had promised, openly and proudly, in the great church near his estate, with the whole county looking on, and if the grand folk came chiefly to stare, the common folk came to rejoice, and there were more honest tears of gladness shed in the churchyard that day than in any fashionable wedding of the season. The Duke had got the thing he had so nearly thrown away, and he knew it, and the knowledge made him a better husband than an easier courtship would have done, for a man values most what he has had to fight for, and the Duke of Inglewood, who had come within a hair's breadth of losing Alice to his own cowardice, never afterward took for granted the happiness he had so narrowly won. He kept always, in some corner of his memory, the picture of the man he had nearly been, the proud, frightened creature who would have married a suitable iceberg and called it duty, and the picture kept him humble and grateful and tender all his days. And Alice, for her part, had got what she had scarcely dared to hope for, a marriage of equals, founded not on her gratitude or his condescension, but on a love that had been proved in the fire and come out pure gold. She had refused to be a great man's secret, and she had been rewarded with the open, honored, public devotion of the best man she knew. She had refused to be made small, and she had been raised, instead, as high as a woman in England could be raised, not by stooping to ask it, but by being worth the giving of it. They suited each other admirably. They laughed together as they had laughed across her father's table. They grew old together in great contentment, and the cold, magnificent world that had been so sure their marriage would be a misery was obliged, year after comfortable year, to watch the Duke and Duchess of Inglewood be quietly, stubbornly, irritatingly happy. It was the best revenge imaginable, and the sweeter for being no revenge at all, but simply the natural fruit of two good people who had been brave enough, in the end, to choose each other, and what became of the great question that had opened the whole affair. The question the Countess of Stourton had flung across her ballroom in scorn, it was answered, in the end, far more completely than the Countess could ever have wished. Who had let the farmer's daughter into the ball? The Duke had, that night. But in the longer reckoning, it was something larger than the Duke that had let her in. It was the simple, stubborn, world-changing truth that worth will out, that a fine soul cannot forever be kept in the place that small minds assign it, and that the distinctions men set such store by are, in the eye of anything that matters, thin as paper and twice as easily torn. Alice Wheatley had been let into the ball, and into the great house, and into a rank far above her birth, not by anyone's gracious permission, but by the plain force of being exactly the kind of person such places exist, in theory, to honor, and so rarely do. She had not changed. In becoming a duchess, she had only, at last, been seen. The worth had been there all along, in the dairy and the lane and the fever cottage, unregarded by the proud, and all the Duke had really done, in the end, was to have the eyes to see it and the courage to claim it before a world too blind and too frightened to do either. That is the heart of the whole matter, and it is worth carrying away from the fire tonight. The Countess of Stourton looked at Alice Wheatley and saw a farmer's daughter, a nobody, a thing beneath her notice. And the Countess was a great lady, and rich, and powerful. And she was, in the only judgment that finally counts, completely and pitiably wrong. For she had mistaken the label for the substance, the rank for the worth, the wrapping for the gift, and she had paid for the mistake by losing, to a girl she despised, the great prize she had been so sure of, and by revealing herself, in the losing of it, as the hollow creature she was. The farmer's daughter, meanwhile, who had been so sure of nothing but her own honest worth, had that worth recognized at last by the one man whose recognition could lift her to the top of the very world that scorned her, and she wore her new greatness ever after, as lightly and as gracefully as she had once worn her plain muslin, being in the Duchess as in the dairymaid. Exactly and unchangeably herself, they were married before the spring was out, and Alice Wheatley, the farmer's daughter, became Duchess of Inglewood, and she made, by the common verdict of all but the bitterest of the snobs, the finest duchess the county had seen in living memory. The world, which had been so ready to sneer, did what the world always does in the end. It followed the lead of the great. When it became plain that the Duke of Inglewood meant to marry his farmer's daughter and to honor her as his wife, and that the formidable old Dowager Duchess stood foursquare behind the match, the fashionable tide began, slowly and then quickly, to turn. And those who had been loudest in their contempt discovered, with remarkable speed, that they had always thought dear Miss Wheatley a most superior young woman. Alice watched the whole performance with a wry private amusement and not a particle of bitterness, for she had never cared for the good opinion of such people, and did not value it any more highly now that she had it. She gave her heart, instead, to the work of being a good duchess, which she did supremely well, for the qualities that had made her a fine farmer's daughter, the sense, the kindness, the honest care for the people around her, made her a far better mistress of a great estate than any pampered lady of the ton would have been. And the Duke's tenants and dependents came to bless the day their master married one of their own. As for the Duke, he never for one instant regretted the courage it had taken to claim her. He had been, for a few cowardly weeks, on the point of throwing away his happiness for the opinion of fools, and the memory kept him humble and grateful to the end of his days. The Countess of Stourton never forgave any of them, and was not missed, and the Dowager Duchess of Inglewood, who had forced the proud world to swallow the best thing that ever happened to her grandson, took the entire credit, and lived just long enough to dandle her first great-great-grandchild, the farmer's daughter's son, the future Duke of Inglewood, upon her ancient knee. So bank your fire now, and turn your lamp low, and let the quiet of the night come down around you. A proud world demanded to know who had let the farmer's daughter into the ball, and the answer was that a good man, who had nearly been too great a coward to do it, had found his courage at the last, and led her out to dance before them all, and made her his honored wife in the teeth of their contempt. Somewhere tonight, by some fire I shall never see, you have sat with a girl the world thought beneath it, and watched her honored above them all, not for any rank she was born to, but for the worth she carried in herself. I should dearly love to know where in the world you are listening from, and I will leave you with this, which is the whole of the matter, that no one is ennobled by their birth or shamed by it, but only by what they are and what they do, that the contempt of small, proud people is the cheapest thing in the world and worth exactly nothing, and that the truest nobility you will ever meet may be standing, all unregarded, in plain muslin in a farmyard, waiting only for someone with eyes to see it and courage to claim it. Sleep well. There will be another fire and another story when next the candles are lit.